Hello Socratenians, welcome to another Socrapod. If you see my eyes darting up and down a lot, it's because I'm reading off my very chaotic computer screen. I have just started a new Socrapod series called Socratena's 7 Deadly Sins, where I do some serious and some deeply unserious deep dives on the 7 deadly sins in no particular order. This actually started because I've been wanting to talk about envy for a long time, and someone in my class suggested that I cover all the other 7 deadly sins as well. So here we are. I would like to preface this by answering what I imagine will be the frequently asked questions. Number 1, is this podcast about religion? No. It's not really. It will touch on it, I suppose, but it's mostly just an excuse for me to talk about whatever I want to talk about. Number 2, am I religious? Yes, I am Anglican, but I'm not what you'd call a super serious religious person. I do still make jokes, I do still question things. And number 3, am I trying to convert you? Absolutely not. I think there is room in this world for lots of different spiritual beliefs, and I don't think there's anything wrong with not being religious either. This will also be a ridiculously long podcast episode because, let's be honest, it's my chance to info dump. So please put this on in the background while you do other stuff, or while you're trying to fall asleep, or whatever. It's meant for being in the background. Now, let's talk about envy. Here is my personal understanding of the difference between envy, jealousy, and resentment. Some of you might have different definitions, but this is my understanding. Envy is wanting something someone else has. Jealousy is kind of a fear of being supplanted, which ties into competition and insecurity. And resentment is feeling like something is unfair. And the lines between envy, jealousy, and resentment can get very blurred. And I've struggled with all three of them for basically as long as I can remember. Do I think envy, jealousy, and resentment are inherently bad? Not necessarily. Like all feelings, they have a function, but when we get stuck in an excess of the feeling, problems can occur. And that is what I personally struggle with. So what is the function of envy, i.e. wanting something someone else has? I believe envy can be a signal as to what you want and a motivator to strive for that thing. It can even be linked to admiration and inspiration. For example, I felt envious of a lot of opera singers when I was younger, and that's what inspired me to pursue my own dreams in opera. But envy can also be a sign of an unmet need. I think that's where a lot of my personal struggles come in, because as a neurodivergent school kid in the 90s, I was quite misunderstood for a while, and my unmet needs weren't always taken seriously. I would unfortunately be mean to other kids because I was envious of them and didn't know how else to deal with those feelings. I would even envy people who were worse off than me because their unmet needs were actually being acknowledged. At the time, I thought if someone was sick or hurt or disabled or living in poverty or part of any kind of oppressed group, they were more special than me. As a young child, I would do things like making fake casts for my arms and my legs out of paper, and regrettably role-playing as having various physical disabilities. I think I did this because, as absolutely awful as it sounds, I wished that my own disability was visible. I wanted to look as fragile as I felt. In some ways, I feel this bled into my current mentality. I felt a strange mix of joy and guilt the few times I actually had medical adventures or misadventures as an adult. joy because I was being looked after and mostly taken seriously. I finally had validation, and the visual things of the hospital setting and the white gown and the oxygen cannula to show like some sort of weird badge of honor, as messed up as that sounds. But I also felt the guilt, obviously, because I knew I should be grateful that I'm so healthy that going to hospital is almost a novelty for me. To this day, I'm not sure if I should have cosplayed as Hazel from Tifios in my old, now privated video about disability and cosplay. I think there were a lot of things I did wrong in that video, and I might do a revised version later, we'll see. And I'm still not sure, even to this day, whether my Shave for a Cure in 2011 was 100% altruistic or just partly attention seeking. My logic at the time was that I'd always wanted to be bald, I'd always wanted to try a buzz cut, so I thought I might as well do it for a good cause. But I still feel a bit guilty because I know some people, unlike me, don't have a choice in that matter. The current school of thought is, if a kid is attention seeking, they need attention. And perhaps that's why I acted the way I did and sometimes still do. I don't think envy is a purely selfish thing. I think it is a sign of a need, a desire, or a lack. I think it's the way envy is dealt with that determines whether it's a quote-unquote sin or not. In hindsight, I think I could have found better, less offensive and less controversial ways to deal with my weird envy complex that I had going on, and to an extent I did, by building a sense of self-worth through achievements and doing good as I got older. But this opened up a whole other can of worms known as jealousy, i.e. the fear of being supplanted. I've always been very competitive, which can be both healthy and unhealthy. The word compete comes from the Latin suffix com, meaning together, and petare, meaning to seek or strive. I've put the definition in the description. So the word compete or competition could be thought of as striving together rather than against each other, which I think is quite cool, but I have always struggled to see it that way. I think I've inherited the scarcity mindset that is ingrained in so many New Zealanders, and also known as tall poppy syndrome. I've linked a podcast known as Tall Poppy Talks in the description, which covers that topic quite well. It's basically the feeling that there's not enough success to go around, so everyone should be at the same level. If someone's too successful, people get angry. I too like resources to be distributed evenly and for no one to miss out on the things they need, but this scarcity mindset can go too far sometimes. I would say I'm definitely an ambitious person. So as a kid, I'd often feel sympathy for characters in books and TV who were painted as the bad guys for being ambitious. Although admittedly, none of these characters are exactly saints, I would like to present some examples. Firstly, Jeddah, whatever her name was, from Clifford the Big Red Dog, who always wanted to be the star. Rachel from Glee, who wanted to be the best singer in the school. Carlotta from Phantom of the Opera, who felt like she was going to be replaced by a younger, prettier artist. And even the entire House of Slytherin, although I do not support She Who Shall Not Be Named, but that's another video. It wasn't bad that these characters wanted success and recognition. They often just went about getting those things in the wrong way. I felt like I was a bit like that sometimes, and there were times when I could come across as overly competitive in the same way. For example, at school, one of my things was the school speech competition, and by the time I was in high school, I was in the finals for it every year, so I saw it as my thing. And by the time I reached my senior year, I was the only person in my year group who actually entered, so I felt like I would bring shame upon my house and my clan and my cow and whatever if I didn't win because I was the oldest student in the competition. I felt the same way about the inter-house music competition as well, because my house had been on a winning streak, and because I was the only year 13 taking music as a subject, I felt like it would be kind of my fault if we broke our winning streak and everyone would hate me, blah blah blah. Even though I wasn't even a house captain, and even though it was the whole house competing, not just the year 13s. In these instances, in hindsight, I think I came off as the asshole, and I apologize. I think a lot of this came from being a big fish in a small pond. I loved my school, but it was tiny, in case you hadn't already figured that out. And it was in New Zealand, a very small country. You'd think that being a big fish in a small pond would make people less insecure, but some have argued that it actually does the opposite. A small pond can cause that scarcity mindset that I was talking about, because fewer people often equals fewer resources, and that leads to that whole tall poppy syndrome thing. Amanda Montell's book, The Art of Magical Overthinking, describes the zero-sum bias and the win or lose binary that comes with the scarcity mindset, i.e. someone else's gain directly meaning your loss. I'm not sure how true the scarcity thing actually is, but I have certainly felt like there are more opportunities to go around now that I have moved to a larger country with a larger population. It is also believed that the zero-sum bias and desire to be a big fish in a small pond are more common in very individualistic Western societies, and that people struggling financially are more likely to feel this way, which I find quite interesting. This would certainly explain why I felt this kind of anxiety so much, both in school and as an adult, trying to make it as a singer and find funding. If you'd like to read Montell's book, I've put the link in the description, and I've also referenced the pages. So is jealousy, the anxiety about being supplanted or having your resources taken away, really justified? Is the scarcity thing real? And is the aggression that can come with jealousy natural or a quote-unquote sin? I remember reading when I was younger that some baby animals fight each other to the death because the infant that gets the most attention from the parent has the best chance of survival, and that's supposedly where sibling rivalry comes from. Despite being an only child, I certainly remember exhibiting what could be equivalent to sibling rivalry towards my classmates at school back in the day. For example, I felt jealous of other disabled kids, or the new kid in the class who got a bit more attention as they settled in, and of people who were younger or cuter or who I perceived as prettier than me. I think a lot of this was because I was always tall for my age and people tended to think I was older than I was. I felt this weird fear of being replaced by the more special child. Was this just survival instinct gone crazy? It's wild to me that I, a healthy little child from a fairly privileged background in a perfectly safe environment, was subconsciously scared of dying. It has been suggested that there is a particularly high scarcity mindset within marginalized groups in certain contexts. Perhaps that would explain why I envied the other special needs children who shared a teacher aide with me. Another example would be women competing for male-dominated jobs. In the context of women in male-dominated careers, I remember hearing someone say, we're all fighting for a seat at the table instead of asking why there are so few seats in the first place. I heard somewhere that little girls like to level out the playing field in their day-to-day play, wanting to make everything fair and equal, and often getting jealous of each other in the process. Please note, the points I made above were things that I heard in various podcasts and videos long ago and have since unfortunately lost the sources for, but I will post the relevant links in the description as I find them. Anyway, how much of this attitude is nature and how much is nurture? There's a lot of talk about counteracting this by being a girl's girl, but as Tara Mooney pointed out, video in description, this movement has almost become exactly what it was trying to counteract. It's like girls in particular can't seem to escape from being pitted against each other. It's easier to focus on your own more immediate problem, i.e. securing your seat at the table, than fighting a whole system, i.e. asking why there are not more seats in the first place, which is why the person who got the seat at the table tends to get targeted with jealousy instead of the exclusive system that limited the seats in the first place. And I think this might have led to a lot of the scapegoating that happens with celebrities. More often than not, I would say, female ones. Obviously, I don't think celebrities should be immune from criticism where criticism is due, but attitudes of, how dare that celeb be so successful at such a young age, their music isn't even that good, or how dare this celeb be an ordinary imperfect human being and make honest mistakes, they should be an expert in every single social issue ever, even if they're just a musician or an actor or blah 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 blah. I think those attitudes can sometimes be really toxic. Like I said, sometimes criticism is absolutely justified, and it's true that celebrities who are wealthy, conventionally attractive, white, straight, cis, etc. are usually not criticized as harshly as those who don't fall into those categories. But it still doesn't feel right to downplay people's successes or expect them to be perfect. I still struggle to find the line between calling someone out and straight up bullying them. But sadly, I have been known to scapegoat celebrities too. I think that's because people are being increasingly pitted against each other, against each other in all areas of the job market, but particularly in the attention economy. So things like performance art, writing, content creation, etc., which is where a lot of celebs tend to be. Anything that relies on other people's attention for success. That unfortunately applies to me as a musician. In the attention economy, it's helpful to have a point of difference that makes you unique until someone else comes and has the same thing as you and takes that attention away. And like the baby animals fighting each other example, sometimes lives do depend on getting attention. For example, the singer who receives more attention is likely to receive more money, whether that be in the form of grants or getting noticed for paid gigs, and is therefore more likely to afford food, healthcare, etc. And even life-saving charities have to compete for attention when marketing. I've always felt overwhelmed when having to choose between charities. For example, some people might need money for cancer treatment and others might need money for clean water. Those are both life-saving things, and it shouldn't really have to be a competition. It's hard accepting that life doesn't always have to be a competition, and more than one person can need and be given things at the same time. But sadly, we are taught from a very young age to base our self-worth on how worthy we are of attention. I am currently trying to base my self-worth on things that are unique to me and can't be measured or taken away, like my personality and my interests, instead of how much I've achieved, how I look, how useful I am, etc. But it is still a very hard thing to accept, especially in the attention economy. I still have this weird anxiety that some slightly better clone of me is going to come along and outdo me in every way. Even though I've had this weird inferiority complex my whole life, As I got older, I realized some people actually saw me as the tall poppy, which felt really weird. At the time, I thought they were just being mean for no reason and was completely baffled. Like, basically, all through high school, I was given crap for having hair that was too long and too blonde. It got so bad that I eventually cut it and people finally left me alone. I just assumed that people genuinely thought my hair was ugly because of the fashion at the time, but in hindsight, I think the haters were subconsciously envious. There's some interesting videos which I've linked below. Dr. Anna's How Haters Tell on Themselves and Tam Kaura's Reality Check, This Is Why People Dislike You, which kind of touch on this as well. The same sort of thing happened when I answered questions in class or had some sort of achievement. People would laugh or downplay it like I was being cringe. And in a weird kind of way, I can sympathize, as I did feel a bit guilty at the time, and because I used to get annoyed with the same 2 or 3 smart kids in my class who always seemed to get the awards and things. Which brings me to resentment. Resentment is the feeling of injustice. So instead of jealousy where you're anxious about being supplanted, with resentment you feel like you've already been supplanted, or that someone you care about has already been supplanted. I think sometimes resentment is justified if things are actually unfair. As someone with the justice sensitivity that comes with autism, I've always felt this particularly strongly, but this has caused some problems. While justice sensitivity can be a good thing, it depends what that particular person's justice logic system is at any given time. I've put a few examples and memes in the description if you want to delve into that further. And my sense of what is fair has changed a lot over time. These days, I like to think of it like those equality versus equity memes. I've linked some of those in the description, but basically it's the idea that different people need different things to make a situation fair. They don't all need the exact same thing. There's also the giving tree analogy, which shows justice as being separate from equality and equity, because justice involves changing the entire system, but because changing the entire system can take a long time, giving different people different treatments can be a much more helpful short-term solution. Another very helpful strategy I found for tackling my own justice sensitivity rule following kind of thing is what's known as both and thinking, perspective taking, and flexible language. These are all outlined in Caitlin Partlow's video, which I've linked below. But I can understand how these things can still be really hard to swallow for a lot of people, especially since this is not an ideal world and these theories don't always work perfectly. I think resentment can be very helpful for making changes. This is why I've done a lot of research on neurodivergent performers, because I resented the fact that it's often harder for us to have careers. I hope that my resentment in this case will be a catalyst for making some positive changes in the industry. I hope the same can be said for lots of different people's resentment of things that are genuinely unfair. However, I find that my thing with justice sensitivity is it isn't always logically fair, is the fact that I always root for the underdog. I do this because I feel I have been an underdog in a lot of situations, in social situations in particular, but that can be an issue, for example, when someone is actually the best in a competition and they should rightfully win. I will often root for the underdog even though they're not the best in the competition, or who I perceive as an underdog anyway. In the past, I got way too extreme with this. As a kid, I saw all kinds of really harmful criminals as underdogs. And because I'd had quite serious behavioural problems as a child, I felt like I could have become one of those awful, awful people if I hadn't been socialised out of it. I now understand that at a certain point, harming people is a choice, and an awful lot of romanticised criminals were not actually bullied, contrary to popular belief, but they were the bullies themselves. But even as an adult, the following things don't really sit well with me. So, number one, when people don't acknowledge the phrase, it explains it but it doesn't excuse it, and only focus on the it doesn't excuse it part. Number two, when people genuinely believe that a person is born bad. I don't know whether anyone is actually born bad or not. I'm not an expert, but I have a suspicion that the vast majority of bad people have become bad over time rather than being born that way. Number three, when someone is considered guilty until proven innocent. However, I now understand that that attitude can be necessary for people to keep themselves safe and for victims to be taken seriously. And that's why, as a Christian, I've had to really work on redefining what forgiveness is in recent years. It's definitely a two-way thing. No one's really owed it, because obviously the best apology is changed behaviour, and people shouldn't get away with doing horrible things over and over again. But I do still struggle with this concept because I find it hard to forgive myself for things I did years ago, even though I was a literal child. I have linked a video on the whole forgiveness thing below if you want to delve more into that. So how do all those things relate to resentment? Well, all of those things that I just described stir up a mix of guilt and resentment in me. I'm really glad that true crime content wasn't as much of a thing when I was a kid as it is now, because I can guarantee I would have felt a weird sense of resentment when listening to or watching it. Even when I watched the news as a child, I would feel resentful when people talked about victims, calling them beautiful and perfect. And even now, when people talk about those crimes on the internet and they'll call the perpetrator ugly or fat or whatever, I still feel like those things should have nothing to do with the crime. Like, why does appearance matter? And I remember when I was a kid watching the news, I would feel really resentful because I would wonder, why do the victims always seem to be girls? At the time, I thought that the media were being unfair on males by only reporting on young girls because they didn't care about boys or about adults. Yes, well, there are obviously media biases, especially regarding things like race and nationality. I now understand that violence towards women and girls is statistically a huge problem. But regardless, it still stirred up that weird sense of resentment in me as a child. P.S. If you'd like to delve further into the topics of media bias and true crime, I have linked some videos below. Got a weird cowlick, kinda like it. My resentment in this case ultimately stemmed from my own insecurity because I had previously, unfortunately, hurt people at school, and I felt that people only loved the victims in any given situation. And I felt deep down, even if something terrible happened to me, I wouldn't be considered worthy of sympathy because I wasn't well behaved enough, smiley enough, pretty enough, petite enough, feminine enough, young enough, exceptional enough, or normal enough. As much as I enjoyed watching shows where damsels in distress had to be rescued or protected, I always felt a bit resentful because I didn't think I'd ever measure up to that archetype. I hated seeing kids get singled out, whether it be in an article about a child surviving an accident or an advertisement using cute little kids to sell a product. Despite at the time being a blonde girl, I resented that it was more often blonde girls than basically anyone else in said advertisements. I wondered if kids who didn't look so cute or feminine or conventionally attractive would get the same attention, or adults for that matter. I also felt that a lot of ads were just plain exploitative of children, and to an extent I still believe that. So often, little girls who've either died or survived some sort of trauma will be catapulted into the spotlight and made poster children for whatever issue they're facing. They'll be called princesses just for existing. The mere fact that the word poster child is actually a term really says something, in my opinion. And as a kid, I resented this so much, and yet I was obsessed. Things like this would make their way into my play acting all the time. I think I even made up designated wooby characters who were constantly going through horrible things and being fawned over for their cuteness. If you don't know what a wooby is, I've put a link in the description to the TV tropes page, which I'm not sure if it's pronounced wooby or wooby. Tell me what you think in the comments. I used to resent people who were called heroes or warriors for going through bad things they had no control over. I wanted to see unpleasant, boring, plain-looking, non-cute, forgotten people becoming poster children too. But perhaps this was because I felt like my personal fight had never been acknowledged. I feel like this might be why there are certain niches of people who have weird obsessions with serial killers and create almost a fan club around them. They're projecting their own insecurities onto someone they perceive as misunderstood because the so-called fans themselves have issues that haven't been addressed. Obviously, I don't think things like bullying, trauma, and neglect are excuses for committing heinous crimes, and I don't think any of the people in question should be glorified for what they've done. If anything, it's one of those it explains it but it doesn't excuse it situations at best. I think maybe the impressionable and often very young people who form these concerning fan clubs need to be shown that their own needs can be addressed in better, healthier ways. Even if you see yourself as one of those misunderstood people who'll never be a poster child, your cry for help doesn't have to be and should not be an act of violence or harm. For example, having been a troubled kid myself, I was extremely lucky to have been shown some good coping strategies earlier in life. I was encouraged to put my energy into caring for people instead of harming them, and I found that I got the attention and self-esteem boost I needed from that. I got praised and recognized for being nice. It was sort of like I did a complete 180 from resenting people being cared for to being the do-gooder. This has its pluses and its minuses, of course. I think it has led me to become a bit of a people pleaser, but I think it was better than how I behaved before that, and I'm really grateful that I didn't continue acting like that into adulthood. Being encouraged to care helped me develop my own empathy too, and I believe that the empathy was always there. I just wasn't quite sure how to use it as a confused young child. I can now put myself in the shoes of the victims I once resented, and I can even put myself in the shoes of the people I resented for romanticizing said victims, as strange as that sounds. I understand now that it's important to give a sick child a good life while they're here, because there are lots of things they could miss out on. I understand now that people might describe a loved one that they miss in a poetic way to try and make the best of a really horrible situation. However, I do still think this stuff can be taken a bit too far, especially by the media when they sensationalize things to sell a story. I still agree with 12-year-old me on that one. But even I found myself leaning into this, "Oh, they are so brave and an inspiration to us all" stuff when I started basing my self-worth on being the super sweet, compassionate do-gooder. When I shaved for a cure, I told the newspaper that it was, quote, my appreciation of cancer patients' bravery, which makes me cringe so hard now. Since then, I have learnt that a lot of people who go through life-threatening illnesses or accidents have no choice but to be brave, and I probably came off as incredibly patronizing. I just hope that the money I raised helped someone. In my teens and early 20s, I felt this constant push and pull between my resentful side and my compassionate side. As a child, I really resented things like Make-A-Wish Foundation, charity collections, community groups for minorities, and human interest stories in the news, basically due to whataboutism. As I got older, I understood that things like this exist to compensate for what certain people or groups of people might miss out on in life, much like the equality equity meme. Well, it's not really a meme, but you know what I mean. But I've even seen whataboutism between some of the people and groups in question. For example, someone who acted out at school due to an unstable or abusive home life might resent a special needs child who isn't punished so harshly for acting out at school. This is again because the former person's needs are not being acknowledged, but the latter's are. It doesn't mean the special needs child should be given less help. It means the child with the difficult home life should be given help as well. It shouldn't have to be one or the other. There's also an attitude of everyone should go through the same amount of trauma because it's a rite of passage. Like when people think that because they were bullied at school, everyone should be because it makes you tough. It can feel unfair when you had to go through something horrible and the next generation doesn't. When we put things in place to make the world a better place, they're inevitably going to be imperfect. Perhaps not everyone will get the grant, the wish, the news article, the community group at first, but the more we try and put these things in place, the more help people will get in the future. I think progress and improvement, even if they make things seem unfair while the changes are happening, are better than things staying equally terrible for everyone all the time. As I mentioned in a previous video, linked below, I think a lot of discrimination stems from the kind of resentment that I've been describing, and even tall poppy syndrome to an extent, i.e. the scarcity mindset. It's something I have to really monitor in myself because despite having white privilege, I sometimes find myself buying into a lot of the resentment towards certain nationalities and ethnicities that seems to be so prevalent. Like, I'm sure you've heard some people say, oh, why is this group so good at that thing? It's not fair, they get all the opportunities. But this attitude can lead to a lot of really nasty behaviours, and sadly no one's entirely immune to it. I've linked a few resources on how resentment has been shown to lead to discrimination below. Admittedly, I even used to resent people from different cultures to my own, especially those who took great pride in their culture. I had the attitude of, why are they showing off like that? When really they were just connecting with their heritage, which is super important. I think a lot of people like me whose ancestors were colonizers have sort of lost touch with their own cultures over the generations, which is partly why things like cultural appropriation happen so much. It's like the joke about the difference between white people and yogurt. If you leave yogurt alone for a few hundred years, it might develop its own culture. And I think we act this way maybe because we're a bit envious. But actually, we do have our own cultures, lots of different ones, as is talked about in the TikTok, which I have linked below. And we can connect to those too. And to be honest, I've only touched the absolute tip of the enormous iceberg, which is decolonization. But in this case, I think because of my privilege, I need to take responsibility for deconstructing my own biases and my own resentments. Racism is insidious and sneaky, and it can unfortunately creep in through things like resentment, like I've just described. If you'd like to delve deeper into the decolonization topic, I have linked a few resources below from people who, unlike me, actually know what they're talking about. And if I've got anything wrong, please let me know. In situations where resentment seems illogical, i.e., when the situation isn't actually unjust, it usually boils down to insecurity. People can appear arrogant when they're actually insecure and they're being defensive. The idea that arrogance is often, but not always, insecurity and or resentment can also be shown in the way people talk about themselves, not just the way they talk about others. For example, in New Zealand, boasting or anything that might seem like boasting is frowned upon, so people will often put themselves down to appear more humble. And I personally think it depends how boasting is done when you're deciding whether it's bad boasting or good boasting. Like, if someone is proud of something, there's nothing wrong with them talking about it. In fact, it's good to be able to celebrate things that we're proud of and recognize when we have talents or skills or creations that are worth sharing. It's only a problem when it's at someone else's expense, i.e., feeling you have to put someone else down in order to make the thing you're proud of seem bigger and better. It goes the same for the nye type boasting when someone deliberately tries to annoy other people by boasting. I think both of these are usually just a sign of insecurity. But on the flip side, I can understand when people's insecurities are triggered by others simply being proud of themselves. I have experienced this before, and admittedly, boasting does sometimes get my hackles up still. But this brings me back to the idea that envy is a signal that we want something. Some of the creators I've linked below say that people often get bitter about other people's good things because they see a part of themselves they wish could be free or develop further or improve. For example, before I realized I was queer, I used to get annoyed with my own community for being loud and proud. I thought they were just showing off. But now I realize I resented not being able to free that part of myself yet. And to be honest, I think an awful lot of queer phobia stems from this. So if you're getting annoyed with someone for being unapologetically and unashamedly themselves, maybe look within and see which part of yourself you would like to give more room to grow. Another response to resentment can be putting oneself down as a defense mechanism, which I am very guilty of. As Amanda Montell pointed out, while less confidence after making a mistake can make you more open to corrective information, and self-deprecative bluffing is often encouraged in modern Western society, like I mentioned earlier, too much negative self-focus isn't really humility. It can just be another form of toxic self-obsession. Again, I've referenced the pages below. I made the mistake of being self-deprecating for way too long, and I think this, combined with tall poppy syndrome, has contributed to my lack of confidence as an adult. I think this causes a lot of the I'm not like other girls stuff that went down in the 2000s and I sadly bought into. I'm sure I said things like, I am ugly and I'm proud when I was a teenager. There was a lot of pressure to look and behave a certain way, but then if people looked or behaved in that way too much, they'd be resented and attacked for it. I certainly resented creators who seem to get popular primarily for their appearance rather than skills, wisdom, etc. And I really resented people, especially other girls, who seemed to have it all, i.e., good looking, intelligent, sporty, and nice all at the same time. I found myself looking for little things to put them down for, like intellect or weight or age or showing off too much of their bodies, etc. It's like that old thing of the smart, talented girl is quote unquote doing you a favor by being fat, even though being fat isn't a crime. And looking back, those attitudes were so toxic. Sometimes I wonder if I would dress or present myself differently if I'd grown up with more self confidence and less resentment. But that's one for another video. This one's long enough already. My phone's almost out of storage. Although I'm admittedly still insecure as an adult, I'm now trying to support others who impress me instead of trying to dim their lights. I like to think that instead of life being one big competition, there's actually room for all of us and the things that make us astonishing. And I hope that through this attitude, my astonishing friends can inspire me to be astonishing too. To conclude, I don't think envy is inherently a sin. I think it's a very normal emotion. It can be motivation to go out and do something, to go get something, or to go change something. But like all emotions, it needs to be used and understood in a healthy way. So I've put a few resources down there that I personally found helpful, and I hope you might find them helpful too for dealing with envy, jealousy, resentment, and all the complicated emotions that come with those. Let me know in the comments which deadly sin you'd like me to cover next, and leave an angel emoji in the comments if you've made it all the way through this incredibly long Socrapod episode.